Welcome to our channel, friends. Subscribe, write comments, like. Thank you, enjoy watching. When husband woke up in intensive care, he heard his wife's conversation, and after what he heard, the long dark corridor along which Edward had been walking for what seemed like an eternity suddenly ended, and a door opened before him. A bright flash of light made him close his eyes. There was a whirring in his ears, and suddenly there was a hum followed by a loud voice. Start life from scratch, but don't waste time. The man felt a strong push and seemed to return to his body again. The place where he had been for who knows how long was becoming familiar to him, and it was a little strange for him to return to his former sensations. He tried to open his eyes, but he had difficulty doing so. Gradually his hearing began to pick up individual sounds, among which Edward recognized a painfully familiar female voice. It was his beloved wife. More than anything he wanted to see her, to hug her, to make her happy that he was back, that he was alive, that he was there. He barely opened his eyes and noticed that there were no people in the hospital room. Around the bed was some kind of medical equipment, from which wires and tubes went to his body. The door to the corridor was ajar. That's where his wife's voice came from. She spoke softly, but the man heard the words clearly. Apparently, Tatiana was somewhere nearby. Edward heard and couldn't understand what and with whom she was talking about. And when will I be able to re-register the property? The answer followed. He will not survive. This confused the man even more, and the buzzing sounded in his head again. The woman continued, and if not an inheritance, can it be done differently, but quickly? And Edward gradually began to understand what she was saying about him, and she most likely decided to appropriate his property. He tried to swallow the lump that had risen, but his throat was dry. He wanted to take at least a sip of water, but he was not able to get himself up and couldn't ask anyone. Tatiana asked with a smile in her voice, "When will you come to me?" She then continued, "And I miss you. I'm looking forward to finally not having to fear his return anymore." Now Edward was certain that he would not reveal his most wonderful return to them. Footsteps were heard along the corridor, and Tatiana's voice stopped them. She asked with her tear in her eye, "Doctor, tell me how much more he has to suffer." The woman replied with a note of her reproach in her voice, "Judging by her voice, she is young. Believe in the best, and don't stand here, please. You'll be informed of any changes." Tatiana asked, "Just please call me." And she went to the exit. The doctor entered the ward and began to press some buttons on the machine next to her. The woman whispered through her teeth, "She is ready to be buried alive, and he will survive all the deaths in spite of." Edward tried to say something, but his tongue stuck to his palate. He uttered only a strange sound instead of words and opened his eyes. The woman turned to him and a smile graced her face. She said, "That's what you had to prove." Then she went somewhere, and then returned with colleagues who examined the man for a long time, took blood from him, connected devices, and discussed something. Then everyone left. Only a young nurse remained who applied wet cotton to Edward's lips. He parted his lips a little and began greedily squeezing the cotton with them so that the moisture got into his mouth. The girl said quietly, "You can't drink yet, unfortunately, therefore be patient a little. You are well done." With great difficulty, he managed to squeeze out the words, "Call the doctor urgently." The girl ran away and returned very quickly with the doctor. Every word gave him pain and discomfort. "You don't need to tell my wife. She shouldn't know. I beg you, I will pay you." The doctor replied, "Okay, don't worry. You better keep quiet for now. We won't tell her. We got you." The woman went out and Edward heard the doctor say in a whisper to the nurse, "I wouldn't even allow such wives to go to the port of the hospital. She longs to hear that she is a widow soon. How the earth wears such people. I would pray for days that he would survive." After a while, the nurse put him on a drip and explained that she would continue to feed him through a vein for the time being. His wife's words importantly kept coming back. How could she be having an affair with someone behind his back? After all, Edward lived for the sake of his family and he did everything to make her feel good. He never limited his wife and finances. He let her live the way she wanted, and now, when he had an accident, she was not upset at all. She was delighted and hurried to decide how to take possession of his property. He was disgusted by the thoughts. He wanted to tell her how wrong she was, that he would stand up to all of the deaths in spite, and now she would not receive a dime in the divorce. A few days passed and the man began to feel better. The doctor came in. "Well, how are you?" She worked every other day and sat for a long time talking to him. Edward replied, "Thank you. I'm doing well with your prayers." And Vera, that was the name of the doctor, was embarrassed and lowered her head. "Well, good. Look, I can't hide from your wife for long that you've regained consciousness. Tomorrow, you'll be transferred to the hospital ward, and then, I understood you, I will have to meet her face to face, although I'm not yet ready for a scandal." I heard when I opened my eyes. Edward fell silent as a tight lump formed in his throat. "I know, I heard it too. I don't understand how she can treat someone she loves like that." "That's what I don't understand either. However, this no longer matters. I will divorce her when I get back on my feet." Nobody called from the hospital, and Tatiana was already impatient to hear that she was now a widow. She again went to intensive care. Tatiana said, "I need to find out how long enough Edward feels. How much longer will he suffer?" She tried to pose as a sympathetic wife. The elderly nurse answered, "Long enough, and he is no more today." Tatiana was delighted, suppressing his smile and pretending to be a grieving woman, turned around and hurried out of the hospital. The nurse added, "Today he was gone in our department," but she didn't hear her words. Edward stood near the window and looked at his wife. She was talking on the phone with a big smile on her face, and his insides were boiling. Edward went to the doctor, deciding that it was time to look into his wife's eyes. He said, "I need to go home." The woman, who is now managing his illnesses in the hospital, frowned. "Are you serious? You were transferred from the intensive care unit in the morning, and you were going to run somewhere. You understand, this matter is urgent. I won't stay here until I've completed it. I promise you that I'll be back as soon as I figure it out. Come on, I'll sign where necessary. I'll either leave or run away if you don't let me go." Edward signed the necessary papers, called a taxi, and followed his wife. When he entered the house, he saw an unfamiliar man who was in his underpants in the living room. He said with admiration, "We will take this fireplace to hell and put in his place a cool sound system." Edward entered the living room. "I didn't disturb you." Tatiana instantly turned pale. She was shocked, as if she had seen a ghost. Perhaps that was the thought that was going through her head at the moment. "Edward, how are you?" he muttered through his teeth. "Shut up. You have 5 minutes to pack your bags and leave, because my security will be here soon and kick you out of here if you don't hurry." Tatiana began to sob faintly, not wanting to lose the money that marriage promised her. "Edward, I thought you were gone. I didn't know how to deal with grief." Edward smirked. "And you immediately found a replacement for me. Tanya, get out. And if you dare to try to achieve something after the divorce, you still owe me to stay." Suddenly, Vera's words flashed through his head. I would pray for days on end that he would survive, and Edward was grateful to her. After all, not every doctor believes that his patient will recover and fights for his life. If not for her, then perhaps Tatiana would even pay to help him die sooner. He was disgusted by the thoughts. After all, Edward wanted to spend the rest of his days with this woman, and he dreamed of the day when she would give birth to a child for him. Tatiana threw her reproaches at her husband when the guards took her out of the gates of the yard with her lover. Only he was not touched by her words. Love was erased like by a hand as soon as he found out what deceitful rubbish his beloved turned out to be. Edward called in specialists who changed all the locks in the house and a couple of hours and asked the guards to watch the house while he was recovering in the hospital. When the men returned to the hospital as promised, he tried not to think that just one accident had completely turned his life around. While Edward was in the hospital for a couple of weeks, Dr. Vera visited him several times and inquired about his health. He chatted with her about everything and nothing at the same time, and this helped him get rid of bad thoughts. After being discharged from the hospital, Edward took up the divorce process. As he expected, Tatiana began to demand her share of the property acquired in their marriage, but this property also turned out to be a large loan that the man took for business development, and they would also have to share the loan. Therefore, Tatiana agreed to sign a document waiving her share of the property. When she got a divorce, she cursed Edward and said words that a person in the right mind would never utter, but the man ignored her, and in an instant, this woman became an empty place for him. After some time, Edward realized that he missed Vera and wanted to see her. He did not even thank her in any way for the fact she helped him survive. He bought a bouquet of flowers and headed to the hospital, figuring that she would be on shift, but the nurse told him that Vera Borisnova was now undergoing a complicated operation. Edward sat down in the corner, deciding to wait for her. After a couple of hours, an exhausted woman with tears in her eyes came out to him and sat down next to him. Edward asked her, "What happened?" Vera breathed a sigh of relief. "A difficult case, but we saved the patients and made him feel so light at heart." She asked, looking at the flowers, "Is this for me?" Edward gave the bouquet to Vera and smiled shyly. "Yes, I'm sorry. I have lost all the skills to communicate with women. I wanted to ask you out on a date, but if you don't agree, I won't be offended." "I will agree. My shift ends in half an hour. A lock will be the best rehabilitation after such an operation, and you also benefit from spending more time outdoors." That's all, friends. Subscribe to the channel. Thank you. Goodbye.